This might unironically be the best game that Bethesda is publishing this year. And yes, I know, but trust me, it's not gonna be as good as you think it will be. Hi-Fi Rush has a lot of different things going for it. It's well written, it's funny, the art direction, cinematography, and animations are amazing, but the most impressive aspect to me is the combat. I played a lot of rhythm games. Rhythm Heaven, Elite Beat Agents, Guitar Hero, Donkey Konga. Lord knows I've played a lot of Donkey Konga. They're my jam. I'd say rhythm games are among one of my top 3 favorite genres. I have not played a lot of character action games in this style. Sure, I've dabbled in games like Bayonetta, God of War, the numbered trilogy games, not the later ones, and Devil May Cry. But despite the fact that I've been having fun, they never really clicked with me. There's something about the combat that I never really get until the second or third playthrough. Well, maybe except for God of War. That combat is just mostly boring after a few hours. A lot of times, the combat also have a tendency to get kinda messy, with attacks flying at you left and right with no clear timing, having you rely on twitch reflexes to avoid or guard against them. Combos also have a tendency to get complex after a while, with the different attacks in the combo having different timings to them based on how long the attack itself goes on for. What Hi-Fi Rush does to alleviate the spectacle a bit is to rein in the unpredictable part by having every attack happen in time with the beat of the music, and this goes for both you and the enemies. This means that you'll always have a defined constant point of when you'll attack after pushing a button, and a really easy way to input button combos correctly. That's not to say that other games doesn't have a certain rhythm to their combat, but Hi-Fi Rush pinpoints the timing of the button presses and punishes spamming the next button in the sequence. Well, it's not as much punishing as simply decreasing points awarded for the combo, and who even cares about points, right? And there's also a slight decrease in damage dealt. This defined rhythm is why I like the feeling of the combat so much. It makes everything flow so much better, and for someone like me who's not that into these kind of games to begin with, it's a big help. Even if you're not as super musically inclined as I am. You can still get a lot from the game thanks to this gimmick, and since most things in the background, in addition to 808, the cat ball floating beside you, and even the UI itself also moves in time with the beat. Literally, no matter where on screen you focus your eyes, you will at all times have something that represents the current beat you need to follow. And if you're still not hitting the right notes, you can even turn on the timing gauge with the press of a button. And if you're having trouble even now, you've got to be both deaf and blind. Listen, I know it's not a joke to be both deaf and blind, and if you're one of those people watching this video, then I just want to say, actually, you know what, never mind. There are bonuses for keeping your button presses in time with the beat, of course, but even if you press the button in the middle of a beat, you'll still execute the attack, albeit a bit after you press the button, since the game has to wait for your move to sync up with the music. That's not to say that the game is easy. On any difficulty above normal, you won't survive long if you can't learn to keep the rhythm. It just means that the skill floor is low. The ceiling, however, is pretty high. The basics of combat includes a light attack, a heavy attack, a distance closing grapple beam, a dodge, and a parry. Oh yeah, and a jump. No one uses the jump. It starts out pretty simple with just the light attacks that go off on the current beat and the heavy attacks that go off on the next beat, and a few combos available by mixing them. The combat gradually evolves the further you get into the game, starting with the synchronization of 808, which gives you a final timing challenge at the end of every combo that increases in damage the closer you are to pressing any of the attack buttons in time with the outer circle hitting the inner one. This beat hit, as it's called, doesn't change the combat much from a technical standpoint, but it does bring more of a punch to it. This is the base for all the combat you'll do, and for some extra flavor you unlock more combos you can buy as you explore the levels by finding rock magazines. They're not exactly hidden, so you'll end up unlocking all the moves as you play normally. Shortly after unlocking the beat finisher, you get access to special attacks, and yeah, I'm not a big fan. Not only because of something you unlock later on, but also because the special attacks aren't exactly all made equal. The first one you gain access to can pretty much last you the entire game without problems, or at least for most of it. It's not until later you get any specials that truly surpass it in damage like Hibiki or Overdrive Slash, but these cost so much not just to unlock but also in terms of resources that they're not really worth it. At least not in story mode. To use specials, you need to fill up a required amount of your reverb gauge. You can fill it up by collecting batteries or by executing attacks in time to the beat. But unless you're heading into some of these shorter battles with an already partially filled reverb gauge, you won't be able to use anything but barely these specials that requires 2 gauges filled. And you often won't have filled 4 bars of reverb until the very last second. This wouldn't be a problem if not for how the reverb gauge automatically depletes after every battle, rewarding you with currency relative to how much reverb you had at the end. And when you can only equip one special at a time, then you're at the mercy of the reverb gauge unless you go out of your way to fill it during combat with some of the attacks that gives you a lot of battery drops. But that locks you into a single combo route. There is an upgrade that lets you equip 2 specials and switch between them on the fly, but again, it's way too costly until late in the game when you could instead spend your gears on more fun or helpful stuff. Sadly, attack specials just doesn't make a lot of sense to use. There are also ones that serves more of an utility purpose, however. Pick Me Up heals you for a bit, and Holo Chai distracts enemies, but I never used them even once, which is why I'm not showing any footage of them right now. I'm sure you can find some uses for each of them, especially if you're going for a high score for some reason, since a lot of them has score multipliers, but in my opinion, your reverb gauge is much better spent on jam attacks. These are combo attacks with your highlighted partner that are triggered by pressing the partner's summon button instead of an attack button during the beat hit. Each of the partners has their own moves, one where you're on the ground and one where you're in the air, each with their own effects. Peppermint and Macaron's ground jams, for example, deals massive damage to enemies' stun gauge, and lifts them into the air if they're vulnerable, which makes you able to initiate an air combo pretty easily. This is not the main draw of the jam combos though, because the second you initiate them, you're invincible, and you always disrupt whatever move the enemy is currently doing, and this includes bosses. You're still open to stage and enemy created hazards like fire attacks though, but most of the useful specials still leaves you vulnerable to attack also, and even better, jam combos only costs 1 reverb gauge to execute, and if you have multiple reverb gauges at your disposal, you can change them continuously with just 1 normal combo in between. This means that you can basically go on forever, or at least until the enemy dies, as long as you have reverb gauge to spare, and make sure to juggle the enemies in the air so that they won't get a chance to recover their stun gauges. Peppermint, Macaron, and Corsica aren't here just for the jam combos though. They also each have a role to play during exploration, and as support during battles. Peppermint's regular charged and counter partner attack will deal a lot of damage to the enemy's stun gauge, and is also super effective against their energy shields. Macaron's regular and counter partner attack deals damage to enemy Z shielding, which can't be damaged by anything other than his attacks. The counter attack dealing more damage as it's harder to pull off. His charged partner attack is a gravity well that holds normal enemies in place and deals more damage to bosses. Corsica's regular and charged partner attack are the only ones that doesn't do any damage, but puts out fires and makes you deal more stun damage on them, while her counter attack lifts stunned enemies into the air. The normal partner attacks are fine, but I never found myself using the counter ones much, and especially not the charged ones. The reason for that is that it can be hard to keep track of everything, and trying to find the right partner and press the call button in the middle of a combo, or even just a hectic situation with a lot of enemies, can be very disruptive to the flow of combat. I started to get a hang of the counterattacks at least during my 3rd playthrough, and it was fun to use them, but I never really used the charged ones even then. You can charge the partner attacks by holding the designated button at the cost of that partner slot recovering slower. However, I think it's too much work for a barely noticeable advantage. The only time the charge attacks are useful is when you're up against an enemy with an energy shield and you can destroy it with just 1 summon of Peppermint when you'd normally use 2, or other fringe situations that you won't find many of in story mode. Peppermint is the first partner you unlock, Macaron the second, and Corsica the last, and they wait a decent amount of time between when they come available. Not just for story reasons, but also to not overwhelm the player with new stuff. The most they introduce at once are basic game mechanics like attacking and dodging. I think they do a pretty good job of spacing it out, except for with 2 abilities. The first one is the Magnet Grab. This gets unlocked at the start of level 2, which might seem early, but the boss in level 1 was sorely in need of it. The magnet grab is awesome. As a traversal mechanic, you get a lot of quick time events that actually feels good to perform, but the important part is its role in the combat, where it lets you bridge any gap between you and any enemy on the battlefield instantly, which helps keep up the flow whenever you're up against enemies that move fast or are flying. Also, the magnet grab is instrumental when you're trying to start an aerial rave combo, and there's not much that feels better than instantly magnet grabbing an enemy after you've sent it flying. The only thing about this ability though is that it can be hard to aim when you're surrounded by a lot of enemies, since it'll automatically target the enemy you focus the camera on and move towards, but this doesn't always work the way you think it will. The other ability is the parry. This gets unlocked around halfway into level 3 and it makes the combat so much more enjoyable. Instead of dodging out of the way of attacks and then scrambling to get back within range to resume attacking, you can now just stand still, parry, and then go on attacking. So, how do these systems work together in combat? Well, let me answer it like this. Hi-Fi Rush, when everything clicks, has some of the most satisfying combat of any game in recent memory, with some caveats. There's a bunch of combos you can use and they're all easy to execute, but there's an obvious optimal path that you should take which will result in the enemy getting thrown into the air one way or another, followed by a magnet grab, followed by an air combo, followed by a magnet grab, and so on. Not just because you'll be able to deal more damage, but also because getting up from the floor makes it impossible for most enemies to reach you with their attacks and disrupt the combo. Aiming for this locks you into just a couple of ground combos, and there aren't a lot of air combos either. During my first playthrough, I was pretty much locked into 3 or 4 different ground combos, and then 2 different air combos. Those were just the ones that felt good and were fun to use. There's one important part of the combat that I feel makes up for the lack of complexity though, and that's the music. For starters, the music in fights is progressive and changes as you climb the rhythm meter ladder. For normal encounters, I think the music gets more intensive after each letter, but with boss fights, I didn't notice much of a difference above B. The songs get more punchy, and the beat gets more noticeable the higher you climb, adding to that feeling of success you get while you're doing good and bolstering your ego. It's amazing how understated the effects good music during gameplay can have on the overall feel of the game, and Hi-Fi Rush nails this aspect. I've also been thinking about this for a while, but I couldn't figure out just why the fighting itself feels as good and satisfying as it does. At least not until I realized that every hit from Chai adds guitar riffs to the background track. It's hard to overstate just how much of an effect this has on the general feel of the combat. It's one of those small touches that elevate everything to a whole other level, and I also think this is a big reason why stringing combos feels so addictive, even if there isn't that much complexity in the combat as a whole. There's still a lot of variety though, thanks to jam combos, parrying, dodging, and all the different enemy types that needs different methods of approach to deal with. But while there's a lot of different enemy types, very few of them makes you use any specific attacks. So when it comes to the melee combos themselves, there's not really any incentive to try and use different ones throughout the fights. Well, you get less points when you use the same combo in succession, but all you need to do to circumvent that is alternate between 2 different ones. I can't count how many times I've gotten an S rank in score that felt completely undeserved after having spammed these same 2 moves during the entire encounter. This isn't necessarily a bad thing though. The combat in Hi-Fi Rush doesn't rely on advanced combos or attack patterns that needs to be executed in order to win fights. You can literally beat the entire game, even on the harder difficulties, without ever buying an additional combo. You can be just using the base ones. I think this was done on purpose. The core of the combat is more about the customization aspect. Don't like using certain combos? Well, don't. Every time there's a special aspect surrounding an enemy that needs to be handled, like shielding or being literally on fire, it's dealt with by using a partner attack. The focus of Hi-Fi Rush seems to be on having a good time first, and then complexity second. You can get a slight edge by choosing the right combo for the right job, like ones with big splash damage for when you're surrounded by weak enemies, or ones that yeets them into the distance when it's getting too crowded. But in the end, the only real effect it has is on your personal feeling of accomplishment. The combos offer a lot of leeway for you to play the game as you want. I mentioned earlier that I used mostly 2 or 3 different ground combos during my first playthrough. In the second one, I deliberately tried to use different ones with comparable utility in an attempt to learn those as well as I had the previous ones, and then start mixing them into my arsenal. But I could never get into that same combat flow as before. This flow returned instantly when I bought those combos I had excluded, and it helped not only with how much fun I had, but I also played way better in general. There's one thing about the combat that's unfortunate though. While the background beat in the tracks have a consistent BPM throughout the game at around 140, with some slight variations here and there that are almost unnoticeable as far as I can tell, there's still a specific mindset you need to get into to keep up with the beat. I've found that this is a common problem with rhythm and character action games in general, and given the genre, even though Tango Gameworks tries its darnest to remedy the problem, with the beat being visually represented everywhere, there's not really any way to fix it. This mind quirk isn't usually very prevalent, at least not for me, but there were a couple of days when I got home from work, tired and just wanted to relax with some gaming, where nothing worked all of a sudden. I kept getting hit by enemies, I died, and I continuously got locked into doing a single combo because my brain went on autopilot. It was miserable. I checked my settings, the FPS and input lag, but nothing was out of order. It was just one of those days. This is why I, at the start of the segment, added when everything clicks. It's not that noticeable in terms of difficulty unless you're playing on very hard or Rhythm Master, the upper levels of difficulty, since they're less lenient with the rhythm timing and actually makes you rely on it for some much needed added damage to your attacks, and especially damage reduction from your parries, but it's definitely noticeable when it comes to the flow of combat. Oh, right, there's actually not a single state of success when it comes to hitting the beat timings. There's a straight up miss, of course, and then there's good and perfect. These give you a pointer to how well you keep the rhythm, but you also can only execute certain attacks when you do a perfect parry or dodge, and this is where the difficulty you're playing at starts to come into the equation. The options are easy, normal, hard, very hard, and Rhythm Master, though the last one is only unlocked after you beat the game once. On easy, you can essentially press buttons randomly to win, and also turn on something called auto action mode. I have no idea what this entails though, since my pride won't allow me to even go near this difficulty. Normal is actually just easy mode with slightly less lenient rhythm timing and somewhat tougher enemies. If you're wondering why I didn't choose this difficulty, jump back 10 seconds and listen to my description of easy mode. For my first playthrough, I went with hard. Rhythm timing and enemy health are the same as in normal, but you get less health drops and you take more damage. I think this is the optimal difficulty if you're somewhat used to the genre, at least when you're starting a new game. Very hard is very hard. The timing is tight, enemies have more health and stun resistance, and you take even more damage than on hard. Rhythm Master is even harder than that, but with the added challenge of keeping your rhythm meter from dropping to D in order to avoid instant death. Oh, right, the rhythm meter. I completely forgot about that, since this is the only difficulty where it's even relevant. Essentially, you start every encounter with a C and a slightly filled bar. It drains slowly over time and when you get hit though, and to fill it, you'll need to perform actions in time with the beat. Since the rhythm timing gets progressively tighter the further up the difficulty ladder you climb, filling this meter also gets progressively harder, and on Rhythm Master, since you start every encounter close to the dreaded D, you'll need to fully utilize everything in your arsenal to stay away from insta-death, at least in theory. Normal encounters doesn't have this problem since you can instantly start attacking enemies. The only times you'll get in trouble is when you take damage early on, since this not only disrupts your combo but also takes away a chunk of the rhythm meter. The only times this is a real problem are during special encounters like during the lift stage, when you need to use Macaron to destroy the brakes, where you'll need to dash around the stage to barely keep the meter from falling. Or encounters where you have nothing to attack, like in certain stages of Mimosa's boss fight, where you'll even have to jump to keep the meter. It's a shame they couldn't find a more applicable way to incorporate the rhythm meter into the difficulty, because as it is, Rhythm Master is basically only a harder difficulty in terms of enemy health and strength, with the rhythm meter being inconsequential in most combat encounters, since not only is it super easy to keep it from falling to the D, but also if you do get comboed by enemies, you're basically dead since they deal so much damage. I will say though that despite this, Hi-Fi Rush has some of the best difficulty scaling in games from recent years. Still, as an ultimate difficulty in a rhythm game, it feels like they should have taken it a step further in Rhythm Master by maybe forcing instant death if the rhythm meter dropped at all, for example. Usually you'll only choose Rhythm Master for when you're revisiting stages on a completed save, so you'll have some health to spare. But you can actually choose Rhythm Master from a new save once you've unlocked it as a way to force the game to be even harder still. Funnily enough, this makes the rhythm meter even less relevant since you'll most likely die in 1 or 2 hits anyways because of the low amount of health you start with. I don't hate myself quite enough to attempt a Rhythm Master on a fresh save, but I did give very hard a go and that was actually kinda enjoyable. It also opened my eyes to a few things. First off, the parry is a godsend. Maybe this also had something to do with how I consciously try to vary more in my combo usage, but the first 2.5 levels on very hard were not that fun. Combat flowed bad, and as a result I died a lot. I mean, I died a lot throughout the entire run, but not as much as in those first 3 stages. This corrected itself almost immediately after I got access to the parry, and didn't have to dodge out of the way of attacks anymore. Second, this game is extremely forgiving with its checkpoints, placing them not only right before and after every encounter, but also between every boss phase, and you always restart with full health no matter how much damage you had taken beforehand. This makes it much easier to take the leap of trying a harder difficulty since the loss of progress is non-existent. The only effect dying has is that it gives you a worse rank at the end of the level, but if you're just there to practice the difficulty, then that shouldn't matter. Third, and this kinda has to do with the checkpoint system too, Hi-Fi Rush really likes its cutscenes, and while I normally love them, I'm not a big fan of having to watch the pre-battle ones over and over again since you can't skip those.
Ready for round 2?
Have you got something new for me?
You did so well in our training exercises. Let's see if we can mix it up a bit.
This again?
Not impressed? Well, I just might have to throw in some surprises. Send him in.
He's not optimized. He'll slow down the simulation.
I don't care what it costs. Get him running.
Here we go!
Let me out.
That's a huge dance. Wreck that budget, guy.
I swear, if I never have to watch Mimosa shove this guy out of his chair, it'll still be too soon. I'm literally screaming and shaking and crying while dragging this footage onto my timeline. And this wouldn't be a problem if they weren't so goddamn long, and how, for some reason, the longest one are always placed right before the hardest encounters. The fourth and final thing I noticed was that you don't really need to learn enemy attack patterns until you're playing at very hard or higher on a fresh save. They're not that advanced, and you can easily get away with taking a few hits here and there when you have near fully upgraded health, but when you're first starting out, that's a different story. Thankfully, Tango Gameworks has a good grasp of the ABCs of game design, so whenever a new enemy is introduced, it's always sent out alone so that you have a chance to get familiar with it. One problem with that though is that you can pretty easily overpower the enemy immediately without it ever getting the chance to show off its moves. On one hand, this can be interpreted as a player problem, but on the other, there's not really anything nudging you into taking the time to learn its moves. And once you've defeated the first instance of the enemy, it'll start getting paired up with other types, so your focus will be split between multiple foes from that point on. You could always go into the training room and practice against that enemy type one-on-one if you're having problems, but it rarely turns into that huge of an inconvenience, so I'm guessing most people would just press on without even considering that option. And that's too bad, right? Because Hi-Fi Rush has a lot of unique and fun enemy types. This still manages to come through even if you don't learn their patterns, but actually taking the time to learn them and successfully parrying every attack in the middle of combat with a bunch of other enemies around as well is extremely satisfying and elevates the experience even more. This only affects the parrying and dodging though, and some enemies have pretty complex attacks. While the majority of enemies have at most 4 attacks that goes off on 4 continuous beats and is telegraphed so that you'll know ahead of time, the samurai types for example have a 10-hit combo that goes off at varying speeds, the last stretch having attacks that go off on half beats too. It's hard to parry, but god damn does it feel great to do, and also puts the enemy into an exhausted state that lets you get in a couple of free hits. Parrying attacks is in general much better than dodging too, since it'll deal heavy damage to their stun gauges, and enemies that aren't stunned won't flinch when you attack them and won't be susceptible to getting lifted into the air to start an aerial rave. The only attacks you have to dodge are the flamethrower shots or other fire attacks that leaves flames on the ground. Hell, you can even parry fucking volcanoes. There are other means of staggering enemies, of course, like using partner attacks or just attacking them normally, but when you have the option of standing still and focusing on the incoming attacks, then why not just parry, right? It's bar none the most effective method. Actually, that reminds me of the one aspect of combat I don't like: external hazards. Thankfully, they don't show up a lot, maybe a total of 5 times or something, but when they do, they're easily the worst part of the level. The problem is that since they're external, they operate independently from the enemies, so you can be in the middle of a jam combo, and the second you get out of it, you're hit by a hazard, and in the case of the electric floors in track 8, they can't be parried. The fire attacks sorta works like this too, but at least with them you can minimize the risk by focusing down those enemies first, or make sure you're not standing within their reach. The electric floors are one thing, but the fire attacks not being parryable feels kinda weird since they show up very late in the game, and by this point, parrying against enemy attacks when you hear or see the cue has been hardwired into your brain. The parry actually carries way more of the variety that happens in combat than it might seem like at first glance. It is, after all, the only means you have of interacting directly with the enemy's attacks. Dodging puts you out of the way of harm, but if enemies have more than 3 attacks or attacks on half beats, you'll need to run away far enough for the attacks to not reach you, and while you can just magnet grab back when the attacks finish, it still puts a dent in the flow, and in my opinion, the fun that the combat brings. Like, seriously, if you think the fights are boring, master the parry and you'll have a much gayer time. The game really does want you to mainly use the parry as your main defense mechanism, and this is made even clearer when you look at all the upgrades that are available for it, and all the upgrades that aren't available for the dodge. Actually, the system surrounding the combat, like the upgrades and additional combos, exists more to amplify your favorite playstyle than anything else. Chips, for example, gives you certain very specific advantages like shorter recharge for your partners or health drops when parrying. You can at most have 5 chip slots available to you, and every chip has 3 levels to it that makes it take up one of those 5 slots per level. The list of chips is huge though, and has a lot of different effects available through them. For example, you can make a parry reverb build that gives you batteries from parries and also makes battery drops give you more reverb. Or you could make a general partner build, or one focused on a specific partner. Personally, I like having Macaron's Lucky Punch equipped for some extra damage so that he'll take down sea shielding in one attack, and then some sort of parry upgrade. The parry modifiers are especially good since most of the big enemies will initiate a rhythm challenge once they're low on HP. I have mixed feelings on these. On one hand, they're really cool finishers and have saved me from death a lot of times thanks to the parry health chip kicking in during them. But on the other, they make the combat screech to a halt since enemies that are about to initiate these sequences are invulnerable to normal attacks, and it also takes a little while until they actually start with the initial trigger. You can bypass them either by blocking or dodging the shockwaves they send out 3 times or something, but that takes a while. Or you can use a jam attack to launch them into the air and deal enough damage to destroy them, but neither option is optimal since you either halt the pace or use up resources unnecessarily. It'd be much better if this was something that was initiated by the player, like the punishment finishers in Bayonetta. The more player control, the better. Alright, so this is going to be an addendum of sorts, so I hope it doesn't completely shatter the pacing of the video. Hi-Fi Rush turned out to become pretty popular, so the devs have been releasing, all things considered, kinda hefty free content updates. The latest one including 2 new modes, Power Up Tower Up and BPM Rush. I suppose I'll also take this chance to mention the Rhythm Tower, a mode I forgot to mention in the main script. Rhythm Tower is the least special of the extra modes available after beating the game, but it's still a different experience compared to the main story. You keep all your equipped stuff and items and need to fight through 60 waves, or floors, of enemies in the course of 30 seconds. That doesn't sound like a lot of time, and you're right. The gimmick here is that you get more time by performing attacks and moves in time with the beat, and also at the end of the encounter based on your rhythm meter rank. There'll be a couple of floors with normal enemies, and then there'll be a boss. At the end, you'll not only have encountered all the bosses, but also some unique enemies that doesn't show up in the main game even. Yeah, it's hard, and the only way to heal is either through specials or health pickups from parrying, or you can spend time, literal seconds, at each rest floor to buy health and batteries. Power Up Tower Up is a different variation of this, and is the first of the two modes that recently became available through the Arcade Challenge update. Unlike Rhythm Tower, you only need to clear 25 floors, and none of these include bosses. But all your stats are reset to the absolute minimum, and you gain more power through clearing floors and picking upgrades before each floor begin, with extra power-ups being available through special challenge rooms. It essentially turns Hi-Fi Rush into a roguelike. The goal is to get to the top with the highest possible score. The way you do that is do good in combat and also gain score multipliers through choosing upgrades that, in addition to upgrading your stats, gives you a disadvantage for that one floor. These can range from a lot of stuff and gives you extra score multipliers relative to how much of a disadvantage is imposed on you. It's the same with added positive effects, except they take away an amount of score multiplier. You also lose multiplier when you die, but you're allowed to retry as many times as you like, so it shouldn't be a problem to get to the end. It's a fun mode, I must admit, but I'm not quite sure about what the deal is with some of these numbers. Life gauge and reverb gauge is pretty self-explanatory, but normal attack and special attack damage isn't something you usually think about, so it's hard to visualize what it means when you get a 15% point increase. It's easy enough once you've experimented a bit, so this is really only a nitpick, but what the hell is defense? I don't remember ever having seen this stat anywhere. Anyways, it's fun, it's free, and it forces you to recontextualize a lot of the specials and adapt to which upgrades you're getting for each floor, so if you haven't tried it yet, I strongly recommend it. To me, however, the star of the show is BPM Rush. It's very simple in concept, the beats per minute increases as you progress in the mode, and since the combat is directly linked to the BPM, that means everything is getting faster. The name of the game here is to get to the end as fast as possible. You're timed, but you don't have a time limit like you do in Rhythm Tower, and instead of the total score deciding your rank like in Power Up Tower Up, here you only need speed. It's super fun and gets extremely chaotic from 170 BPM and up to the final round at 200. Part of why I love this mode is because these are speeds you're never going to get to fight at during the normal game, and I kinda missed a bit more variation in the pace of the combat since there's not really any way to fight faster since you're locked to a certain tempo based on the beats per minute the game gives you. This mode actually lets you keep your current equipment, but since this is speed-based, you're going to need to think about what to spec yourself with and how to play to maximize damage, and since you don't have to worry about survivability because you get fully healed between rounds, you're incentivized to go full-on berserker mode. See, the core of why I like these modes are because they force you to think differently from the main game. I think that was it. I think I've covered most of what I wanted to talk about when it comes to the combat. Like I said, the skill floor is low and the ceiling is high, and I hope you understand what I meant by that now. There really is a lot going on here, even though the combat seems kinda shallow up front, and the main gimmick of everything happening in time with the music definitely helps make it feel unique at least, and if this game is anything, it's unique. Both announced and released the same day, Hi-Fi Rush was a game that came literally out of nowhere, which is pretty impressive considering it's by all means a AAA title. Usually this kind of tactic signals a lack of faith in the product, since the publishers doesn't want to spend money on marketing a game that they feel won't bring in enough money to make it worth it, so they just release the game and hope for the best. There might have been some of this attitude going around, considering this is a Tango Gameworks game who are mostly known for survival horror with the two Evil Within games and then an action-adventure, Ghostwire Tokyo. All three of these have more of an adult aesthetic, right? So suddenly releasing marketing materials for this would go completely against the already established maturity of their games. It's a shame though, because you could literally pick any cutscene and any 2-minute clip of combat gameplay from the game and it'd make for a perfect showcase of what this is all about. There's so much style, confidence, and love that's been poured into every aspect of Hi-Fi Rush that it's hard to imagine someone thought this wouldn't sell. I mean, they went to some pretty extreme lengths with the care they put into this game. Since this is a rhythm game where everything you do is synced to the beat of the background music, the music itself is obviously a large part of the focus. There are original tracks that play throughout these stages, of course, and they're mostly bangers, though they tend to sound a bit alike each other thanks to the tempo having to be pretty much the same throughout the whole game, since a lot of the timing depends on it. But they managed to implement 10 pre-existing tracks from bands such as Swan, the Black Keys, and even fucking 9 Inch Nails. That's pretty cool, and even if you're not a huge fan of the rock genre, I think they chose good songs that have a more universal appeal to them. And hey, if you're streaming the game, they even have an option to turn on streamer-friendly songs, so that you won't get content ID'd and sued into oblivion by greedy record companies that wants your $10 of ad revenue for daring to use just 5 seconds of a song they didn't even make themselves. That said though, the cutscenes does flow a bit better when you've disabled streaming mode, so it's pretty clear that they were made with the copyrighted music in mind. Anyways, it's not just the music that's taken great care of, but also a bunch of other small things. For example, whenever someone's speaking, there's always a portrait of them next to the text box that reflects their emotional state, and I know that this sounds really basic, but it does help bring the game to life, especially during the dialogue that takes place during the more bare exploring parts. There's also how everything in the game moves in time with the beat, from the lines on the walls to the arrows on the signs lighting up one after the other, to everything that happens during cutscenes. They're really making sure that this is a rhythm game through and through. In line with that, there's the art style. If it didn't already occur to you, then let me point out that this game is hugely influenced by anime and to some small extent Western comics. There's just no way the bopping environments would have worked out or looked as good as it does without this particular aesthetic. You could argue that the cell shading technique hasn't evolved that much from when games like Wind Waker or Jet Set Radio came out, and yeah, you'd pretty much be right on the money. Still though, it is very refined. There are some parts that will cut from cel-shaded gameplay to a hand-drawn cutscene, and while it is a little bit jarring, it's not the worst? Maybe because you're used to it by the point they show up because the portraits are hand-drawn? Most cutscenes are done in engine though. I'm not too clear on why exactly some of them are hand-drawn. It doesn't make sense as a stylistic choice, so the only other thing I can think of is technical limitations. I imagine the part where Rekka literally breaches the panel edges and knocks the bomb out of the hands of this drone would look really weird in engine. Actually, maybe it's a mix of technical limitations and style, because this next one looks really cool.
I'm gonna reason with it.
Well, we had a good run.
Look, man, I think we have more in common than we do apart. How about...
The cutscenes in general are all mesmerizing to look at, especially coupled with the music. Not only are they beautifully choreographed and has an amazing pace and cinematography to them, but they're also funny as hell, and the animations are some of the best in recent memory. Some of my favorite moments come from the cutscenes, and they elevate the story and the game as a whole. The art style carries a lot of weight here too, and Hi-Fi Rush utilizes cel shading to the extreme. As a result of that, you get a game that's surprisingly expressive despite how most of the in-game models are supposed to be mass-produced robots. Of course, the writing and voice acting also helps skew that feeling in a positive direction, because yeah, every piece of dialogue is voice acted, and the voice acting is actually good. Like, really good. Like, I can't remember the last time I thought the English voice acting in a game like this was this consistently good. I don't know why, but my favorite line in the entire game is this one from right before you face Rekka.
You're paying me double for this.
But I'm not paying you anything.
It's just something about the delivery and the timing that hits all the right notes. I also think most of the writing itself is pretty good. It has a nice mix of humor and exposition where you'll often learn at least some small thing about the world whenever you talk to someone. There are also reoccurring characters with their own little storylines, like this one robot that wants to ask out another, and then these guys who are supposed to be some kind of inspectors, I guess, who you can find in every level, often commentating on the absurdity that's happening around them in a pseudo-intelligent manner. Even then, all these different NPCs have unique voice lines for when you hit them, and in the case of Smidge, the tutorial Fred even has unique dialogue when you skip his hints. This, combined with the foreshadowing of events like the Armstrong Festival, makes this feel like a living, breathing world. The game is actively encouraging you to interact with it, and this makes it much more interesting to explore and engage with the NPCs, which creates a feedback loop that makes the world more interesting, and so on and so on. The side content is pretty good, however the main story itself is pretty basic, although I do think they make some, maybe not interesting, but fun narrative choices here and there. The core of the story is that you're a group of kids working against a group of bad guys in order to save the world. There, I just explained not only this game's story, but also like 90% of all shonen anime. Well, that's a bit disingenuous. They're not really kids. In fact, they're all either in their 20s or older. Chai, the main character himself, is supposed to be 25 years old, even if he acts like he's 16. And that's pretty much his entire character. I mean, I think he's fun, but as far as I understand, there's not a lot of people that like him. I guess I'm used to this kind of character archetype to the point where I don't mind. I mean, he has some good moments, but nothing that would subvert your expectations based on his introduction. What you see during these first 5 minutes, a guy that doesn't have a care in the world and just wants to do his own thing, unable to actually play the guitar or not, is what you're gonna get throughout mostly the entire game. I think he's well written though. Yeah, it's a bit weird how well he fights, despite seemingly never having trained in anything for even a day of his life, and his attitude between when he meets up with Peppermint and just wants to get out of there to after he finds out that Vandelay is developing a mind control software that affects everyone with a Vandelay robotic implant, which by extension also affects him, is kinda weird, but that's pretty much the only things that feel off. And hey, at worst, it's just a minor thing, and is also a very small part of the overall story. The writing around him is good enough so that it never feels too out of place. Some of my favorite Chai moments are when everything ends up working out despite his best attempts to ruin it, like the first encounter with sea shielding or the confrontation with Corsica. But as a result, there's never really any character growth, because when whatever Chai does ends up working out, there's not really an incentive for him to change, right? Even when he's literally shot out of a cannon and misses the target, the only thing that happens is a small inconvenience in the form of having to go up a few stories to where he was supposed to land. Basically, he starts out as an airhead and he ends the game as slightly less of an airhead, but not by much. At least he's actually trying to learn the guitar. In the role of Chai's polar opposite, we have Peppermint. She's first introduced via 808, a robot cat that she created as some sort of scouting tool, I guess. 808 is also how Chai will interact with the rest of the cast while out on missions. So this is how it'll usually work for the gameplay sections. Anyways, Peppermint is the leader and brains of the group, although I hesitate to say leader since they're more collaborators than in a strict hierarchy. She's for the most part the driving force behind the plot, being the instigator of the investigation into Vandelay, and also its sole agent until she recruits Chai. She's not really a team player though, or at least not when dealing with Chai, who basically completely disregards her plans and does his own thing whenever he gets the chance. This is at least how Peppermint is portrayed early on, someone with a relatively short fuse, as pointed out by Cinnamon.
Oh wait now, Peppermint, don't get mad.
Unsympathetic? Hot-headed? You don't even know me.
You are only proving me correct.
And a disposition for plans that obviously doesn't fit in with the character traits of the main actor. I mean, it's amazing how many times she gives Chai the objective of stealthily infiltrating somewhere and then gets mad when the exact opposite happens. Still though, Peppermint is very much the glue that holds the team together, and over time, even though the change isn't very drastic, learns to deal with the team as a whole in a more level-headed manner. Or it's just that she learns to go along with Chai's dumb ideas. This change starts to happen gradually after the introduction of the pair of Macaron and Cinnamon. Macaron was the previous head of R&D at Vandelay until Kale took over the company and demoted him in favor of Sanzo. Cinnamon is a psych robot created by Macaron in order to analyze and keep his ambitions in check in order to better his product designs. This duo acts like the voice of reason within the group, with Macaron mellowing out any disagreements between Peppermint and Chai, and Cinnamon being a savage beast.
I can see you truly have no idea. How sad. I saw all your terrible decisions take place in real time, but there was nothing I could do to help. Mr. Chai, we all make mistakes, especially you.
I think this guy is my favorite character in the core group. He's surprisingly expressive, considering his only actual expressions are literally drawn on his face with a whiteboard marker. He also has one of the most hype moments in the game and is the only character outside of Chai and 808 that you get to control directly, albeit for a very short time. Macaron is also the original source for the info about Spectra that got Peppermint to act on her plan to take down Kale. Being super pacifistic, he couldn't act on the info himself, and this trait is basically what defines his character. From the way he speaks, to the way he acts, to the way he punches obstacles and enemies out of the way. Okay, maybe that last part wasn't very in line with his character, but it speaks to how far he's willing to go for the cause when he puts himself that far out of his comfort zone in order to help. This is how he starts out though, and neither he or Cinnamon really changes throughout the game, maybe except Macaron gets a bit less pacifistic, I guess. There's not really much character progression being made here for anyone but Corsica, and even then they're not reaching very deep. Corsica starts out as an antagonist, working as the head of security at Vandelay. As such, she's assertive and has a strict sense of justice, but, according to her official bio, is one of the more reasonable of the top brass in the company. Still, it's clear that she demands the respect of her employees, judging by the robots being on their best behavior when she's around. Being the last addition to the crew, she doesn't really get a lot of time to flaunt her characteristics in the group setting, so a lot of her character exposition is done in the stages leading up to and during her boss battle. The core of the plot in Hi-Fi Rush revolves around getting access to all the 6 bosses' access keys in order to put a stop to the Spectra mind control project. The only problem is that, fittingly, as the head of security, Corsica is the only one without a physical key since she has completely memorized her access code, so the only options are either to capture and force the key out of her, or recruit her to the cause. From the moment Chai makes her aware that she's the only one lacking permission to the Spectra project though, it's pretty clear that the plot is going for the latter option. I don't think it's badly done or anything, but there's not really any suspense present as to what's about to happen. I guess it's all about the journey, because it does have some great moments. It culminates in Kale trying to kill Corsica. He doesn't succeed, but she does get heavily injured, which requires the team to outfit her with Vandelay tech in order to save her life. And just like that, Corsica realizes the darkness looming behind the corporation and joins the group. This also effectively gives all of the characters an incentive to stop Spectra outside of their feelings towards the company, seeing as they're all outfitted with Vandelay tech, which makes them exposed to the mind control protocol. Everyone except Peppermint, since her Vandelay gear was made directly by her mother, which you in many ways could say was what kickstarted the corporation's focus on robotic implants and gave rise to the eventual Armstrong project, led by Kale Vandelay. The whole reason why Peppermint is so set on taking down the corporation isn't necessarily because of the Spectra project, though it certainly helps justify it, but probably mostly because she feels that she and her mother, the person that founded the company, has been slighted. It's revealed at around the midway point that Kale is her brother and that he, in Roxanne Vandelay's absence, has steered the company in the completely opposite direction of what their mother apparently intended. Peppermint having run away from home at the time, and with Roxanne not being seen since Kale took over, would mean that there were no one to dispute his claims of being the successor to the company and also an only child, as if that has anything to do with it. I mean, he used his mother as a test subject for a prototype Spectra and essentially staged her retirement and the passing of the torch to Kale, so why even go through the effort, right? The only answer I can come up with is that Kale is a petty guy with an inferiority complex against Peppermint, believing that their mother always favored her. Kale in the role of the big bad works okay enough. He's shown to be kind of an asshole early on, so it's easy to get an initial dislike for him. Then you don't see him for a while until the museum, where you get most of the backstory, and to his credit, he goes after Chai and Corsica himself, which is the final straw that brings Corsica over to the other side. But other than those 3 appearances, he doesn't show up in any meaningful way until the last battle where you fight him one-on-one. even during the penultimate level, he's basically just hiding away while controlling a huge robot from afar, and not really doing anything special. Kale is being portrayed as short-tempered, egotistical, and frankly, kinda boring. I think this is intentional. He's more of a people person than the guy with the ideas, which is made obvious when it's revealed that the whole plan behind Spectra is not world domination or anything overly villainous like that, but to broadcast subliminal advertising so that the people with robotic implants will subconsciously want to buy more Vandelay products. It's a fun twist, I'll give them that, and the fact that the plan is being built up to being something much more sinister makes it all the more funny. The plan actually being about making people buy his products because he's horrible at coming up with good ideas completes his character. I just wish he'd be given more screen time other than the vague minor appearances he has here and there in order to develop that trait further. Also, for some reason, the cutscenes involving Kale usually has the worst dialogue, and at some points what he says and does comes off as overly childish compared to the rest of his appearances.
After I get a coffee.
We shut down the cafe.
When I said close the campus down, I didn't mean the cafe!
You said close down everything.
But not coffee, Roquefort, not coffee. You always need coffee for things like this.
In fact, now that I think about it, he's basically just evil Chai. Yeah, he even has a love for puns. Still though, Kale is by far the least interesting of the top brass. The other characters are much more fun and nuanced. Maybe that was by design to highlight the corporate hierarchy where the charismatic idiots are often at the top and surrounds themselves with yes people that do all the thinking as long as it aligns with the leader's intentions. We're starting in the wrong end here, but this is also reflected in the boss battle against Kale, where he's almost exclusively relying on the tech of his Vandelay exoskeleton to overpower you, in contrast to the other bosses whose tech serve mostly as a tool to draw out more of their individual potential. Rekka is a good example of that, but since we're talking about the bosses anyways, let's start at the very beginning. The first boss is the extremely intimidating QA1Mel, a giant robot torso attached to a rail-mounted arm. This guy is foreshadowed through advertisements that are placed along the first level, but he's not very developed at all. This is where I make another joke about how he's just a torso. It's a very video gamey boss with clear weak points, which is something I'm pretty sure the rest of the bosses and even the enemies doesn't have. The contrast is kinda weird, but I guess it being the first major foe, the devs wanted you to have the option to dispatch it quickly. And it really does go by fast if you target the weak points, even on the harder difficulties. Like most of the other bosses though, his fight has 3 phases. The first phase is pretty simple and is designed to get you used to his most basic attacks, like punches, where he'll leave his hands on the platform and open to attack for a prolonged time. There's also a lot of dead time between attacks, so you have a lot of chances to attack without having to dodge anything. The second phase starts when he reaches 3/4 health, where he brings out 4 rocket launchers that are firing projectiles, which he'll combine with his attacks from the previous phase. Kinda overkill for a quality assurance machine. He's also a bit more aggressive and has an area shock attack. This attack goes off a bit too fast. If you've started an air combo, which is often the only way you'll be able to reach him, and he starts charging the shock, then you're almost guaranteed to take a hit from it. There's also how, since you need to jump to reach him for the most part, it's too easy to fall off the edge of the platform without really registering what happened. One moment you're attacking and the next you're put back on the stage with a little less health. This is why I think the magnet grab is introduced a bit too late, because this is the perfect enemy to try out and demonstrate its advantages on, especially when he reaches the last phase. At 2/3, QA1Mel enters Serious Mode with this awesome graphic. Seriously, these graphics, whenever the bosses get serious, are always a highlight and you can fucking feel the pressure emanating from these screens. During their last phase, bosses generally just gets more aggressive, making use of their entire moveset, though some of those moves has added effects sometimes, only faster. A bit too fast in this case though. It's hard enough to attack this guy when he's standing still, but when he's constantly darting around everywhere? If you're fighting QA1Mel on a fresh save, you also don't have access to the parry yet, so in order to avoid his attacks, you need to use the dodge. Sometimes multiple times in a row, which means you'll most likely get far enough away so that you won't reach him. And also, since his ground punches now discharge electricity, it's really hard to find a window of opportunity of more than a couple of seconds to attack. Like, the moment you reacted to him punching, the shock has almost already gone off, and then he lifts his hand right afterwards, so unless you're right next to the hand when it lands and don't have to run to it, you are going to miss most of the opportunity, especially if the shock hits you. The hand will stay for a little while, but you still need to reach it before he lifts back up. And you really want to attack the hands, since they after a certain amount of hits can be used to deal a critical hit, I guess, which deals a ton of damage and also unlocks his head as a weak point when you've done the QTE for both hands. So yeah, that's another reason why the magnet grab would be nice to have here. The fight is actually way more fun when you revisit it with the magnet grab. When you don't have it, you're forced to wait for one of the big attacks where he leaves himself vulnerable. But he'll randomly use those, either one after the other, or with a full minute of other attacks in between. That said, I still think this is not only a great first boss, but also a great boss fight in general. I'm kinda having trouble describing just how fun I think this fight is. And it's not just the fighting either, but also the music. The song that plays during this is 1 Million by 9 Inch Nails, but mixed in a way that the only thing you hear clearly are the drums, which are by far the most iconic about this song anyways, but there are some vocals in here. However, they've removed most of the distortion in the background in favor for a cleaner track that fits better into the game. It fits the aesthetic and timing of the fight so well that you'd almost think the track itself was literally made for the game. Like I said, it's a great fight, and as it turns out, that's true for all the bosses in this game. Like Rekka. The bosses all usually have 2 stages each that are mostly dedicated to fleshing them out. Well, except Roquefort, since that kinda plays into his character, but we'll talk more about that later. In that sense, Rekka gets the short end of the stick, since QA1mil totally steals the show of what's supposed to be her first stage. That's just the boss of the first level though. For the rest of the stage, it's all Rekka, which the game makes crystal clear since she's everywhere. Don't get me wrong though, this is something I love about Hi-Fi Rush, which we'll talk more in depth about later. But for now, let me just say that this game does an amazing job of highlighting the antagonists with dialogue, cutscenes, and advertisement posters scattered throughout the stages, giving them just enough time in the spotlight for them to remain interesting throughout their levels, despite how they're mostly one-note characters. Rekka is the head of production, and as such is also in charge of quality assurance regarding the Project Armstrong subjects. This is where Chai is at odds with her, since he's considered a defect, and the Vandelay way of dealing with defects seems to be crushing to smithereens nowadays. Actually, that's how Rekka deals with anything else that goes wrong in production too. As such, she's portrayed as being Macho Man Randy Savage. I mean, come on. Referring to herself in third person, her other mannerisms, it's almost too obvious. Still though, I like her. Her appearance is obviously wrestling themed with her giant belt that says boss in the middle, and so is her fight, with the arena being a big square with pipes around it resembling rope, which makes the whole thing look like a giant wrestling ring. As such, her attacks are also wrestling themed. Well, some of them at least. Phase 1 is relatively tame, almost to the point where you start wondering if this is supposed to be a boss fight at all. Even the music is likewise just as weak, although it does make for a great introduction of Rekka during the cutscene before the fight. The boring parts all disappear the second Phase 2 starts though. I swear to god, this is where the style of the game really hooked me. Rekka literally electrifies herself, and for a little while you have no other choice than to avoid her attacks. Even if you have the parry available, you will need to dodge these. Thankfully, they're not hard to see coming, and since you literally can't touch her when she's electrified, you get to focus purely on dodging. It's a nice swan song for the mechanics, since the second you get the parry in the next level, dodging gets obsolete for most of the rest of the game. The electricity stops surging through her either after a little while or after she uses a big shock attack that makes you jump or use the magnet grab to avoid being hit, which makes her need to cool down her robot arms. It's not just the fighting that gets more dynamic from face to face, but also the music, and Phase 3 is the perfect example of this, synchronizing the guitar riffs in the song to Rekka throwing pipes at Chai. The music gets progressively more dynamic as the fight progresses, which makes you feel like stuff is amping up and getting more serious. If Phase 2 was when I fell for the style of the game, then Phase 3 was when I truly realized that this would be something special. After this sequence, she starts attacking with the pipes normally too, but the dodging part is only at the start. Phase 4 is when turbo mode starts and Rekka adds all her attacks into the rotation, even combining the electricity and pipe tricks. Most devastating though is probably still the cinematic grab attack, which she'll use from Phase 2 and onwards. This is easy to parry but hard to dodge, and if you get caught you're guaranteed to take some heavy damage during this multi-hit combo. I'll come right out and say that while the attack has a lot of build up to it, I'm still not a fan, but it's pretty much the only thing I don't like about this fight. To finish this off, the song playing during the fight is Free Radicals, originally by the Flaming Lips, but this is actually a cover by Elsinore with added claps and some other small stuff, since the beat in the original has a tendency to fall off a bit at certain points. I understand the dedication to include this one, it's super fitting. After the fight, Chai and Peppermint hack into Rekka's PC to access some Spectra files, but then unwittingly takes part in a conference call between the bosses where Chai triumphantly holds up the belt of the woman he just brutally murdered to show the rest of them that he means business. That's kinda dark. Anyways, this meeting not only gives you a quick introduction to the rest of the bosses, but also plays a part in starting to show off the next guy you're going up against, Sanso. I fucking love this guy, and like, how can you not, when every time he's on screen he's posing as a JoJo character. Even his hand-drawn pictures has the same go 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 effect that's so iconic for the big bads in JoJo. Sanso isn't much of a fighter though, so instead of giving him a boss battle, they give him a lot more presence in the 2 levels leading up to his defeat. In the cases where there isn't a big boss encounter waiting for you at the end, you're basically just met with an extra hard normal encounter. You can't say that Sanso's boss fight is the very level itself though, since you're actively draining his health in the form of a development budget, leaving him defunded when it reaches 0. I'll admit that I was a bit disappointed at this point that there wasn't a big fight like the previous one with Rekka, but this is so fucking funny that I'm willing to forgive it. Hi-Fi Rush subverts your expectations like this when it comes to the boss battles, and because of that they're never boring. And that's why the boss fights are some of my favorite moments in the game, because of this, which you'll see when we talk about the rest. Anyways, Sanso here does have one attack, but gets immediately smacked by Chai when he tries to use it. Sanso is easily influenced when someone questions his ideas, and is therefore easily roped into Chai's attempt at squeezing money out of him by fooling him into sinking dev resources into the AR environments just to prove something. As pointed out by Cinnamon, Chai is surprisingly good at antagonizing people, which is literally how he wins against Corsica. Talking about this fight without talking about the build-up would be a shame. So, starting from when Chai gets captured after almost escaping R&D, he successfully manages to plant a seed of doubt in Corsica's mind when he mentions how she's the only one of the bosses that doesn't have full access to the Spectra files, which is especially weird since she's the head of security. Throughout the levels leading up to the battle with her, she often talks about being busy with other things and warns the employees not to disturb her. Turns out she's busy researching Spectra. These monologues are also where you'll get a small payoff if you've been paying attention to these data files scattered throughout the levels, where some of them chronologues the adventures of a service tech going around updating the coffee machines and then being confused as to why the update forces the machine into making only decaf, much to Corsica's dismay. I think this is a good example of optional supplemental information being tied into the main part of the game, making the payoff greater and making you excited to seek out these extra bits of exposition. I couldn't really find anywhere else to mention this, so here we go. Anyways, the fight itself is actually just a conversation between Corsica and Chai with some rhythm parry events in between, like the ones certain enemies use when they're almost dead. I'd almost forgotten about this, since I'm so good at the game, obviously, but when it comes to these, you need to hit a certain percentage of the inputs correctly in time for the event to progress. It's not that disruptive to fail when it comes to the enemies, but when there's dialogue that needs to be repeated when you fail, it's a bit weird. This is also the first instance where they add dodges to the rhythm event too, so it's actually a bit harder. Still, you should be pretty used to these by now. I at least rarely took any damage, even on my first attempt. Hey, I even managed to ace the surprise QTE at the end where you need to catch Corsica. I love this touch so much, but this is one of those rare cases where succeeding makes the following cutscene slightly less believable. Honestly, I'd rather have Chai miss the save on a success, because that'd not only make me laugh my ass off, but it'd also fit a bit better in the following cutscene. I mean, he's been failing upwards in the entire fight until that point, so why not, right? Interestingly, this QTE was meant to come a bit out of left field, since the devs thought failing it was the funniest outcome. Next one up of the bosses is Mimosa. Now, if there were anyone of the big six that I didn't expect would actually fight you one-on-one by themselves, that would be her. I mean, look at her. She uses her employees as chairs and has makeup being employed down to the last possible second for even just a boring meeting. Instead, this is one of the best and most varied boss fights in the game. Mimosa is the head of marketing, so of course she's going to be a shallow and vain person, and of course the battle takes place on a literal stage with her name in giant neon lit letters as the backdrop. To start off, she's mostly airborne, only landing when you break her stun gauge or when she's doing certain attacks, and this limits your options of attack. But she's also protected by a force field that's being generated by her dress. This basically just gives her a huge stun gauge that you'll need to deplete before she takes any actual damage. In true video game fashion, this gives you a huge incentive to use your, through calling in Corsica, newly acquired ability to deal increased stun damage. To speed up the process, you're also expected to parry her attacks, which are heavily telegraphed through audio cues, even more so than in any previous fights. In the first phase, she has some lasers and notes she'll deploy in a certain rhythm, some other small attacks, and a cinematic grab that's really hard to avoid. The attacks themselves aren't what makes this fight so unique though, that belongs to the overall variety in what happens. This encounter is built up like a stage show, with wildly different phases to it. In phase 2, she cuts the lights and calls on some helpers so that you'll need to either guess which spotlight she's at or wait until she makes a move. This is also when she'll start using one of her specials, Vandelay's side story. I'm not quite sure what this is supposed to achieve other than looking cool though, because while it can be confusing at first, she's really only opening herself up to attack. Maybe that's the point, to lead Chai into the center so that the guys coming in from the side has a clear shot. In the bridge between phase 2 and 3, you're thrust into a relatively tame rhythm battle reminiscent of a Parappa the Rapper battle. It's not hard, but it feels right in place and lets Chai finally live out his rockstar dreams on a huge stage. At the start of phase 3, Mimosa will always engage her second special, Equalizer Wave, which can be a bitch to deal with if you're playing on Rhythm Master and die during this phase, since you're not getting much of a chance to attack and need to jump in time to the beat perfectly to maintain the C rank. As a final challenge, because why not, there's a rhythm parry section which ties a nice ribbon on the whole thing. I think this fight actively makes use of every single combat mechanic the game has to offer, and that, along with all the back and forths between Mimosa and Chai, is what makes it so damn good. There is only one instance in this game that surpasses this boss battle, but for other reasons, which we'll talk about a bit later. But for now, Rogue Forge is an enigma. Until the moment you enter his office, he's by far the one member of the Vandelay team you know the least about. The contrast between him and Mimosa kinda speaks for itself. This is of course all done on purpose, in order to drive in the point that he's a wolf in sheep's clothing. Literally. He's literally a giant wolf. I don't know guys, this just feels a bit too on the nose for me. The transformation sequences are really fucking cool though. The fight is good enough, right, and makes great use of a somewhat remixed Wolfgang's Fifth Symphony. This is more of a return to form, a more classic boss battle I guess you could say, and it doesn't have that much more to it than Rekka's fight. His special Big Bad Wolf is impossible to clear without the aid of Corsica, and you can choose not to call her in during it, which results in an immediate failure, but you almost have to go out of your way not to, since the game automatically selects her for you whenever you're caught in the attack. So the only thing you have to do is press the partner button. Roguefort in his wolf form is fast, deceptively so compared to his size, so this is a fight that requires a lot of focus. The goal is to overload his wolf form in order to get him to revert to his human form where you can actually damage him. During phase 1, he'll just run around the arena, shielded by either an energy shield or a sea shielding shield. During phase 2 though, he'll summon in a wall of lasers that you'll need to dodge and some drones you'll need to parry as you make your way over to him. Though it's not made clear enough that you're actually supposed to chase him down at this point, I think. Once you realize this though, you only need to use a magnet grab to fly over and start attacking. Phase 3 is when the fight starts getting fun, with the introduction of an attack where he'll burrow into the coins like Scrooge McDuck and chase you down a few times before jumping out and diving at you. I only figured this out by a fluke, but if you position yourself next to the giant golden fist, he'll hit that instead and get stunned for a short while, which allows you to get some free hits in, so that's pretty nice. Roguefort being defeated literally by money falling on top of him just when it seems like he'll never go down is kinda funny too. I guess that just leaves Kale then, huh? Despite how he's portrayed during the rest of the game, this guy is a force to be reckoned with. He starts off the fight by mind-controlling Chai, which leaves 808 alone to take him on. 2 hits later though, and the mind control is broken, which is where the real fight starts. As a real final battle should, this guy incorporates almost all of the previous bosses' tactics and patterns, from QA1 swiping attacks to Rekka's directional charges to Mimosa's lasers. He, of course, has some of his own also, which makes him the boss with the most variety in his moveset and forces you to make use of everything you've learned so far. Even the dodge comes in handy. Like, this guy is hard. During phase 2, he's just attacking normally, but during phase 3, he brings out some robot arms which you'll need to handle with partner attacks before you can destroy them to make the fight a bit easier. He's a bit docile during these phases, but that all comes to a stop when he powers up for phase 4. This arena, situated on the top of the Vandelay tower with the lightning going on in the background, acting as the perfect backdrop for a final boss battle, all the while 9 Inch Nails' perfect drug plays, perfectly complementing everything that's going on in the battle. It's amazing, and the relief I felt when I finally took him down is almost indescribable. He doesn't do anything special like Mimosa, he doesn't even have a single weak point like Roguefort. This fight is as pure of a test of skill as it gets in Hi-Fi Rush, and that's honestly all I need to say about it. That statement itself should speak volumes of what I think about the fight, and you'll understand what I mean if you've been following along this far. The absolute highlight though comes at the end when everyone on the team pitches in for a final beatdown, cementing their bonds as a group and friends. It can't be overstated how much these boss fights brings to the game. Not just in terms of gameplay and story, but musically as well. The fact that the team managed to make these songs fit so perfectly to everything that happens is yet another testament to the love that's been poured into developing this game. While it probably seems that I, through my unending adoration for much of this game, have only high praises for Hi-Fi Rush, that's not quite the case. Let's talk a bit more about the levels themselves, since they've gone pretty much untouched until now. A lot of the level design is sadly below par, and this is where the game is at its worst. This is also the majority of the game. Thankfully, worst is relative, and misunderstand me correctly, it's not like this part of the game is unsalvageable or anything, it's just that when compared to the rest, it's kinda boring. You do get a lot of character development and other info through character dialogues while you're running around, and this helps alleviate the boredom, and as you're getting access to more party members, they each get stuff to do in the stages, which is well balanced between them. You also have instances of rhythm QTEs here and there, but there are still far too many parts where you're just wandering around through empty hallways where nothing happens. There are also collectibles laying around in secret areas, or in most cases just slightly out of view, so you'll be looking for those too, but it's not really enough. It feels like the game wanted to have a focus on exploration and platforming as well, but the exploration parts mostly ends up empty and lifeless, and the platforming is actually awful thanks to the jump and air dash being super rigid. When jumping from platform to platform, it feels like a single jump won't reach and a double jump will go far beyond where you want to land. It's really weird. The jump works for combat, where you need it to be rigid in order to have better control of where you're going, and I suppose this was what their focus was with the platforming being an afterthought, but it's not like they couldn't have changed the jump slightly when exploring, right? Either way, you never use the jump during combat anyways, since the second you get access to the magnet grab in level fucking 2, it's obsolete in combat. Even during my third playthrough, I still hadn't gotten quite used to the jump. It's that bad. Thankfully, there aren't that many advanced platforming challenges during the normal routes, but you'll need to use the jump more when looking for collectibles. These are health upgrades, reverb upgrades, and pieces of health tanks that each requires 5 pieces to complete the upgrade. Feels like a lot of work when you can buy them in the store for not very much money, but that supply is limited, so when you run out of stock, you'll need to chase down the ones in the levels if you want to upgrade Chai further. There's also Armstrong circuits, which are used to upgrade chips. Some of these collectibles though you can't find until you gain the ability to revisit stages with later team members available, either through blocked paths or the Spectra doors. These are what's supposed to be your incentive to retread the stages, I guess. It's not much for post-game content though. They're basically just rooms with minor combat challenges like don't jump or use only partner counters to defeat the enemies, which by the way sucks since you have no chance of clearing unless you specifically use Macaron and equip Macaron's Lucky Punch, which increases the damage he deals, and to do that you'll need to quit the level and then go back to the room. I don't get how they thought this was a good idea. Oh, that reminds me, you actually get some optional voice lines if you quit and restart the game when in the middle of most stages. That's a pretty neat additional attention to detail. Anyways, once you've cleared a Spectre room, you get to choose to either continue the level or go back to the hideout, but that still doesn't take away that even if you know exactly where the door is, you still need to get there from the start of the stage. Especially when you're actively looking for these rooms, it might take much longer to get through the stage, and without any collectibles to look for, especially in the later levels where you had access to everything, is honestly just a hassle. I mean, it's fun for the first 3 or so tracks since you have access to the parry, and also defeating the sea-shielding enemy with Macaron causes Cinnamon to interject, pointing out that this shouldn't be possible at this point, but I don't know. The reward for clearing these Spectre rooms are, well, more Spectre rooms with a joke cutscene at the end that feels kind of out of place, but hey, extra content is extra content, I guess. There are a few places where I feel like these stages do a good job though. For one, they mostly look really good. The only ones I don't like the look of are track 3 and 4. I get that this is supposed to be a simulation, but the reuse is a little bit jarring, especially when you literally traveled through those very same environments just 15 minutes ago. Sanso's presence does make it a bit more entertaining, but ultimately it's just more of the same in too close proximity. But let's keep focusing on the good parts. The levels are all mostly really well decorated, either with general stuff or stuff that's unique to whichever character the levels are leading up to. This makes the game world alive in a sense. The best part of the levels are when the set pieces are used either during combat, like the falling platform in the museum, and when the environments play into the story or has its own thing going on. Okay, so one more negative thing because that line reminded me. In stage 3, Macaron hacks some stuff which closes a door and opens up a side passage which he tells Peppermint and Chai to use instead. The problem is that you end up the exact same place as you would have if you went into the closed door, except it's a massive detour. Like, okay, what was even the point of that? It's just padding. Anyways, these stages also have a role in setting up combat, and one of the best, no, the best encounter in the game happens after Chai gets shot out of a cannon and lands in the Vandelay cafeteria. Just the idea is funny to me, but the cutscenes leading up to it and the reactions when Chai lands in the middle of a room full of robots dining cracks me up every time. And then comes the music. The track that plays during this encounter is The Prodigy's Invaders Must Die, and you're immediately sucked into the combat. This is bar none the best single instance in the entire game, and I know that people have been going crazy about this encounter, but it really is that good. The enemies, the music, the interlude where the team all works together for the first time in order for Chai to proceed. I love it. The team works together a bit later during the fight against Sanso's huge robot, but somehow it still just doesn't hit the same. This right here is peak Hi-Fi Rush, and I really wish I could play this gameplay clip with the song in the background, but alas, you'll have to experience it yourself. Or go find a video from a creator that doesn't care about getting demonetized, I guess. When it comes to the music, they actually do a very good job with it within the stages as well. It's progressive too and reacts to what happens, changing from room to room sometimes even. It's actually amazing how well even just the basic stage themes are implemented, which again speaks to the skill on display here. And I think that's it. This was not supposed to be a 15,000 plus word script, but the more I wrote and thought about the game, the more ideas popped into my head. The combat, the music, the story, the characters, a little bit of the stages, I guess, they all combine to make one of the best games I've ever played. I really did not expect Hi-Fi Rush to make the leap to my top 5 favorite games of all time when I first saw it. Hell, I didn't even think it'd reach top 10. But the amount of love and care that Tango Gameworks put into this silly little project of theirs really resonated with me. It's almost like they made this game to cater to my exact preferences. If Tears of the Kingdom didn't release this year, I am certain that Hi-Fi Rush would have been my game of the year. And even then, it's still closer to the top than you'd think, and that's pretty much the highest praise I can give it. Didn't anyone ever tell you not to bring a knife to a gunfight? Yeah, and that's why I brought my guitar. What? Yeah, that was a really bad idea.